wanted to start by thanking Adam for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a real privilege. I'm very excited to be here. I'm not so excited that I dressed up or wore a Halloween costume. I did make a spooky version of my title slide to start things off. And I wanted to start by asking a few questions from the audience. So who here today is on a team that has data scientists on it? Okay, most people, that's great. And for those of you who raised your hands, how many of you, did your team hire a data scientist in the last year? Okay, good number. How many of you tried to hire a data scientist in the last year and had some struggles with it? Still lots of hands. And how many of you work on teams where you're planning to hire data scientists in the next year? A lot more hands. Okay, so that's great. I'm glad to see all of that excitement. You're in good company. So it's not surprising to me to see so many of you working on teams where you've actively been adding or looking to add more data scientists to your organizations. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is an article from 2012. From the Harvard Business Review describing what the authors were describing as an emerging role that was becoming increasingly in high demand. So maybe there is a Halloween costume idea in here for anyone who wants to, if you want to dress as a sexy data scientist circa 2012. But hyperbole aside, I think one of the main points that this article is making, and many other people have made, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, is that data scientists are both difficult and expensive to hire. And I don't think they mean that data scientists are difficult. They are difficult to hire and expensive to hire. Hiring data scientists is also a really important task. It's important to all of you who raised your hands. You are all on teams that are trying to hire them. We spend a lot of time in our modern life at work with our colleagues who we decide to add to our teams and work closely with. These are important, impactful decisions. 2012 is an important year for another reason. It's the year that Insight was founded. So I work at Insight. The concept of Insight in 2012, when it was founded, as it is still today, was to bring together a group of talented and sharp PhDs who are individually, each of them, about 90% of the way towards having all of the skills and experience necessary to jump into data science roles. But they're lacking some key pieces. And so then by working with them over the course of about a month and a half, we could get them 100% of the way to where they need to be. In the first year, Insight worked with about 30 fellows. People in that first year went to places like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Yammer. And so there was a lot of early signal that Insight was onto something. And since that time, we now work with an average of 20 to 30 people every single session that we run. And so we're running about 10 to 12 different sessions, depending on different iterations of different programs in different locations. And we do each of those programs, once we've got it sort of fully scaled up, roughly 3 times a year. And so in 2017 alone, we actually worked with close to 500 fellows. So the talk is not about how to come and be part of Insight, but I did want to take a minute to remind everybody. I checked this morning. As far as I can tell, we are still accepting late applications for our first sessions that will be starting up in 2018. They'll be happening in a variety of cities, in a variety of programs. You can go to the website to check out where each of those programs will be happening in the new year. I think that's all I wanted to say there. Okay, so pulling back a bit then to talk about what Insight is and where our experience then comes from in recruiting and hiring data scientists. So Insight is an education startup that helps scientists and engineers start new careers in data. We do this by running free programs. These programs are 7 weeks long. They're completely free to the participants, and they're full-time fellowship programs. The freeness of it is important for making sure that there are no barriers to access to the program, so we get really great people apply and they can all come. Insight, the programs themselves have a very strong emphasis on social learning. So I often get asked, what is Insight's curriculum? And if Insight does have an official curriculum, it's certainly not a list of machine learning algorithms or statistical methods. A lot of it is more focused on how to know what you know, how to know what you don't know, how to figure out how to get from not knowing something to knowing something. We're very excited for people to bring the talents that they already have and apply them in the real world and apply them in a business context. So if we were to try to kind of fix a specific curriculum around what is the work of a data scientist, not only would that quickly become stale and out of date, but anytime someone is confronted with a problem or a scenario or question that they don't know how to answer, we haven't really equipped them with the tools to be able to get to an answer. Another way that we make sure that what the fellows are actually working on and learning is by putting a lot of sort of work around learning from one's peers and industry mentors. So the alumni of our programs come back and spend a lot of time with the fellows, mentoring them in specific areas. We have a lot of friends, many of whom are in the audience today, who also come back and give their time as people out there in industry who are working as data scientists, working as data engineers, who come back and speak directly to our fellows about, if you're going to build this, here's how I would suggest you do it. If you're going to analyze things in this way, here are some caveats or things to be aware of. Ultimately, the goal is for everybody to start those new careers. And so we do also have a component of training around how to be successful in an interview context. So there's some training around professional skills, as well as just giving the fellows a bit more of a sense of what to expect in that interview process. The interview process in industry is wildly different from any of the steps that they've taken thus far to move ahead in their academic careers. So that's really important for them. So then to step back and just give you a little bit more, even sort of not talk so much about the program itself, but then if you think about like what Insight is doing more broadly speaking, it's hopefully will resonate with a lot of you who have been building data teams. So we start by identifying and then recruiting potential data scientists that we want to bring onto our team. And for us, what that looks like is since our founding in 2012, I went back and looked at some of these numbers. There's 20,000 applications in our spreadsheets. And as a team, collectively, we've conducted thousands of interviews with candidates. The next step then is to onboard those individuals and train them up as a team. And then again, to use language that we don't really use in the programs, but that might look a little more familiar to you. Every new member of the team produces a functioning prototype of a data product within their first 20 days of being a member of that team. Since 2012, earlier in the summer, we hit a new milestone, which is that there are now 1,000 alumni who have come through our programs who are working in industry. They're working in a big cross-section of teams, and so that releasing them back into the wild, they're now at a wide range of companies across a bunch of cities, and as I mentioned, we then repeat this over and over again. And so what's nice about the repetition for us is that we're able to iterate quickly on processes like changes that we want to make to our admissions process or any sort of step along this way that we feel didn't quite hang together, didn't quite work as well, didn't give us the signal that we were looking for. We're able to make changes and deploy those across all our programs. So I thought I would try to hit on 4 areas to sort of share some of my experiences, our experiences at Insight. I'm hoping to kind of move through this material relatively quickly and leave plenty of time for questions, but I'll also be doing office hours after the lunch break. So starting off with finding people. My biggest piece of advice is to start by doing things that don't scale very well. Most of you are on teams that are not going to be hiring 100 data scientists in the next year. So you can afford to do things that don't scale when it comes to hiring, when it comes to people. For us, what that looks like, although we do try to scale some of these things, the first piece of this, of my advice is to try to, as much as possible, to talk to people directly. So at Insight, what that looks like is a lot of university outreach and mailings that go out to a network of department administrators, career counselors at universities, and various other sort of like contacts that we have in that community. The university outreach, though, a lot of it is in-person visits, and those visits, instead of coming to a place like Columbia, which I've done a number of times to give talks, my talks are not really about Insight. I have a lot of stuff to say about Insight in the talks, but the point of the talk is not, this is what Insight is and how awesome it is, and you have to come to Insight if you want a career in data. The talks are generally, what does a career in data even look like for somebody coming from a quantitative research background? What does the landscape of opportunity look like? Because that's one of the key questions that most academics want to know more about is, what else out there can I even do? They're working and living, and I say this from firsthand experience. I was myself, in this pretty tight bubble, which I was very happily ensconced in that bubble. And so when I started talking to my PhD advisor and other people in my department about what I thought I wanted to do after my postdoc, I got a lot of encouragement, but not a lot of good concrete advice. And so it's our hope that in our university outreach that we actually go and give some good concrete advice to people. So providing people with actual content that's useful, we do that through the university outreach. We also do a lot of it on our blog, and this is a way that we can also help shape the signal that candidates are giving us in our admissions process. And so you can think about this as well in your own recruiting efforts. Think about the things you want people to know about you and lean into those subjects and try to highlight them as much as possible. So on our blog, we've actually written a number of posts about how to prepare for coming to the program, or how to prepare for careers or prepare for career transitions. Career transitions are hard and scary, and they're deeply stressful, and we want people to come into that experience knowing what some of the scarier or harder parts of it are, and equipped to handle it. There's like we were hiring for a position at Insight. This is not related to fellows, but we were hiring for a position, and we wrote a job description for it. It was a new role, and we wrote the job description, and I was really nervous about getting qualified candidates, and so I looked at a lot of other job descriptions for similar kinds of positions, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna borrow a lot of this language, and this sounds really good, and I'm gonna use this. And I wrote the most boring, generic job description I could probably have come up with. And we posted it, and we got a lot of candidates who applied really quickly, some of whom had lots of very relevant, great experience. But when we started doing phone screens with them, or initial calls, or even just looking at the cover letters that people were submitting, I was really shocked, because I thought I would see a lot of people saying, I'm really excited to work at a startup, I'm really excited to work in the education space, I'm really excited about this overlap between education and technology and data, and I got none of that. And I realized when I went back and looked at the job description that we hadn't said anything about our team, or the size of our team, or the sort of culture of what it's like to work at Insight, or what are some of our goals and missions as an organization. Those things might seem very transparent to the outside world when they're very clear to you, because you live and breathe your own life and your own culture, but they're not that clear to people outside of your organization, and you have to be explicit about them if you want them to signal that stuff to you. If you write a generic job description, people are going to be like, cool, sounds like a generic job, I'm qualified for it, I will apply. If you write something that sounds a bit weird or sounds a little bit out there, it's true that you might turn off some candidates who are like, I don't quite get this, but probably those are candidates that you're not interested in meeting. Okay, so moving along then, another really good strategy that we've had a lot of success with is leveraging your existing network. So at Insight, what that looks like for us is we look at alumni recommendations very carefully. Our educational program, with its emphasis on social learning, is pretty unique. It's not for everyone, and so when an alum from our program says to me, oh, hey, I know this person, I think they'd be really good. They're doing that with a sort of hindsight of experience of knowing how stressful or how difficult the program was at times, and so that recommendation means a lot. The problem with all of the things that I've just said is that you're going to have gaps in your network, and when you talk to people or when you describe your data science role as like a ninja or something, like you're going to just like, when you start using coded language to talk to some people out there and not others, you're going to create gaps in that network. And so you have to actually do a lot of work to cover those gaps. We do this in a lot of different ways. An example, though, is collaboration with Women Who Code, an organization that we've partnered with to provide some additional scholarship support through people who apply to Insight through connecting with them, and then it helps us reach out, do outreach in their network. So figure out what gaps you have. That takes work. Work even harder to address them. This is not something that's going to. It's not something that's going to be easy. It takes actual work to do. So don't be lazy about it, I guess. Okay, so this other thing about finding people. So know who you're looking for and know who you aren't seeing. This is a little bit related to these gaps. And so I just wanted to show some data from our program. So DJ Patel, who's now the former chief data scientist for the United States, but one time was quoted as saying that the best data scientists tend to be hard scientists rather than computer science majors. I feel left out of this a little bit as a ecologist and evolutionary biologist. It's a pretty hard science, but depends on who you ask. What DJ, I think, was driving at, and what a lot of people have interpreted this to mean, is physics. And so what I'm showing here, without any numbers, are the sort of fields of study of all of the past candidate applications to the Insight's ever gotten. I'm just showing like the top 10 or 11 here. So physicists listened, and they have been applying to our program in droves for many years. We also have a strong representation from neuroscience, from biological fields. One of the big gaps here, though, is there's a lot of quantitative fields that aren't represented in this list and who clock in at very, very tiny percentages of our total applicant pool, but who we're still really excited to see show up. And so whether it's specifically going and doing informational sessions or giving talks to departments in fields such as these, or keeping an eye out for those applications when they come in. It's been very exciting to us over time. Insight was founded by a physicist, and so another reason why our early network is comprised largely of physicists, astrophysicists, is because of that. And so again, working to know what your network looks like and push against it. But so folks who are coming from social science backgrounds or other fields where the work itself is highly quantitative or can be, and then going and finding those people in those areas will bring a lot of not just diversity of background, but diversity of thought and approaches and methods and things like that. And there's a ton that people can learn from one another. The other thing that is always really exciting to me when I see people coming from these backgrounds is these are all fields that are deeply human. And for many people working in data science, a lot of the questions that we're trying to kind of use data as a proxy for is some human decision making. And so these are fields where things like selection bias and how surveys are conducted is a big part of the work that they do. It was not a part of the work that I was doing when I was scooping tiny organisms out of lakes in Michigan. They were coming and getting in my sample bucket whether they liked it or not. But these are fields where you have to think a lot more carefully about those types of biases and things like that. I threw this in here mainly because it's one of, I have heard many things over my 3 years at Insight that are terrible, that come from people who are trying to grow their teams. One of my biggest pet peeves of all time is to hear that we only recruit from top schools. For me, this just signals that you're being incredibly lazy, and you're not even really willing to read someone's entire resume, let alone look at the full extent of their background. And so these kinds of heuristics of well, I'm looking for a particle physicist who has this many years and name checks these technologies in their resume, and I'm done, might be a good way to sort of whittle down the thousands and thousands of applicants that you're getting to a smaller, narrower pool, but it's probably not a great way to design your search. Okay. Again, and then this is still part of finding people, going out there in the world. This is the longest part of this. So at Insight, we're really lucky because we're in the position of being able to accommodate a really large group of people every time we run a session. Not everybody who comes to our program needs to be super excited about doing client-facing work, if that's part of what your team does, or has to be able to code in Scala, or needs to be deeply familiar with causal inference. It's good for the group if several or many people in the group have those skills, but not everyone in the group needs to have them for the session to be successful. You might be in a different position where you have a single slot and you need that person to check a lot of boxes. But if you can approach how you're building your teams and how you're thinking about them as a sort of composite of many skills in many areas, and people are able to cover the gaps of others, I think that'll help you. So these are just sort of reiterating some of the points that I've made in the last couple of slides. Writing a very generic job description will get you a generic pool of candidates. Okay. So then moving on from how do you find people to then thinking about interviews. And so here, I'm not going to talk so much about Insight's own interview process. Again, because it's an educational program, it's a different, what we're looking for is different in certain ways. I wanted to sort of share some observations about the sort of process that teams generally use in industry to hire data scientists. And so like many other roles, whether they're technical or not, they start with an initial call, and this might be with somebody from an HR department who has your resume in front of them. It might be any member of the team. These initial conversations, fellows often describe them to us in these surveys that we do, which is where the sort of data for this comes from. They often describe them as behavioral, but really when you look into what are the content of the questions that are often asked in these kinds of interviews, a lot of it has to do with scheduling. A lot of it has to do with the team communicating directly to the person. Here's what the job actually is. Here's who the manager would be. Here's the team that's actually hiring, things like that. So it's more around communicating to the candidates and clarifying of details and things like that. Following that, candidates are put through a variety of technical phone screens, but the icon I chose to use here is a laptop because increasingly these involve a shared live coding environment like CoderPad or some other tool where someone is asking the candidate to walk through some type of problem that involves a live coding, and so that's for that. Data challenges where a candidate is given a piece of work or a question or a set of data and sent away with it to work on it for some number of hours are an increasingly popular tool. I was surprised, actually. I thought the numbers would be higher. I went in and looked at the number of teams, not just the number of individual data challenges that have been handed out to fellows, but the number of teams amongst all the teams that we work with, number of teams that actually use data challenges. And it's actually only about 20% or 25% of the companies that we work with. The numbers are slightly lower here in New York. It's about 20% of teams that Insight works with. In California, Bay Area, it's closer to 30%. I suspect that some of that has to do with when companies do decide to work with us. That might be a stage that they're often choosing to skip over. But I also think that data challenges are great, but they also are very time-consuming. So they're time-consuming for candidates, and I would encourage any of you who are using data challenges as a way to weed out candidates or vet them or rank them or score them, to make sure that you've actually taken the time to work through your own challenge or give it to a pool of people where you can get honest feedback from them on how long it actually took them to do the work that they've submitted to you. Candidates underestimate the amount of time they spend on these. You're never going to get around that. And so it's possible that teams are, at least being smart in let's not use this all the time if we don't have to, because they do involve a lot of work. And then one thing though that I have seen more and more is instead of submitting whether it's like a notebook or some piece of code to run, or here's a written report, but actually having candidates come in and deliver a 30 to 40 minute presentation of walking them through, here's what you asked me to do, and here's how I went about doing that. For me, what's nice about that is it actually gets back to what data challenges are designed to do, which is put the candidates in a scenario that really mimics what it might actually be like to work with the team. So that's the goal. Almost all interview processes culminate in one or more on-site interviews with the candidates. These on-site interviews often have an enormous behavioral component to them. Candidates are always most freaked out by having to get up at the whiteboard and reverse strings, but actually talking to people about why they want to be at that company, why they want to join that team in particular, what excites them about the work that the teams are doing, those are huge, huge pieces of it. The nice thing about so breaking it up into these 4 categories is a nice way to conceptualize this. And it might be nice if this was sort of the process for how things worked everywhere and uniformly across the board. It looks a little bit more like this in reality. This is actually totally fine, though. It's okay to move candidates. I mean, these categories are they're not that meaningful in and of themselves. And candidates are fine with multiple steps as part of an interview process. I've never heard someone really complain about the number of steps being too big unless they felt at any one stage like their time was really being wasted. Like if they start talking to some people about a role, they move through the technical screens, get to the on-site, only to realize that they're actually being considered for a different job than the one that they initially had talked about with the recruiter. It's a huge red flag for them because it means that you guys aren't you're not organized and that their time is being wasted. And on both sides, that's a real concern. So don't give data challenges without actually testing how long they take to do it. Don't say that you're going to call them on Thursday if you're not actually going to call them on Thursday. A lot of these, a lot of my advice here is really treat them the same way that you would want to be treated if you were going through the process. I think something that comes up a lot with academic candidates in particular is if you can avoid putting them in any situations that feel like an examination, you will get stronger signal from them about how they're more likely to behave on your team. They have a lot of Pavlovian responses to things that are called like take-homes or they retreat back to learned behaviors from their academic experience that can put them into really confrontational mode, that can put them into a sort of like, oh, I just have to spit out the right answer and that's all they're looking for kind of behavior. So as much as possible, try to engage those candidates in a more conversational way, and there's different ways that you can signal that to them, even just by explicitly saying, this whiteboard thing that we're going to do, it's not a test. I'm not here to sort of put you on the spot and demand like instant recall of obscure facts and formulas. I really just want to talk to you about a problem and see how we would work through it together if we were to be on the same team. And even that can diffuse the situation and put them much more into a headspace where you're more likely to actually then have a good experience. Whether or not the interview is successful or not, you're at least more likely to get better signal from the encounter. Oh yeah, I had another, so maybe sometimes you go from this right to the onsite. That's fine too. Okay, so last thing I wanted to say about it's not really related to interviews, although salaries and salary expectations come up a lot in interviews. I wanted to put this graph up and ask you, what do you think it's a graph of? Salaries for men and women? How many people? Most people, that's what yeah. So it's not, I tricked you, sorry. That's trick or treat. So this is actually salaries comparing fellows who have left Insight. First year base salary for cities of New York and the Bay Area. So there's a bit of a bump. We should all leave New York and move to San Francisco if we want to raise our base salaries as starting data scientists. So I put this in here for context because I'm delighted to show you our actual lack of gender differences in first-year base salaries for fellows leaving Insight. And this is, this is not what you see when you go out and look at like the O'Reilly surveys or other data that's out there. I think what this is signaling is a few things. One of them is that there are practices in industry, there are standards that are that exist out there in the world. There's like the condition, the general human condition, and then there's the things that we can do to change that. And one of them is just by being a little bit more, giving everybody a little bit more access to information and education. So sharing information about what's normal and what's expected. And so some of this has to do with people better understanding their market value. It has to do with normalizing the idea of negotiating a salary in the first place. There may also be some bias in the companies that are represented in this data set, because we've certainly stopped working with teams who've been jerks for various reasons. So, but anyway, so I just wanted to include that in the interview process. Okay, so this what's next part, these next two parts are pretty fast. So after people become data scientists, what do we see amongst all of those 1,000 alumni? What do they become next? What does their next job look like? So I ran through we don't have a ton of data here, but I think these numbers they're okay. So most of them, or not most of them, sorry, about 30% of them, their second role in this new career is also as a data scientist. Sometimes that's because they've joined a new team or moved to a new company. Sometimes it's just more specialized, so machine learning data scientist or product analytics data scientist or something like that. 15% of them tend to sort of pivot or shift a little bit more towards software engineering or data engineering or machine learning engineer positions. Another 30, little more than 30%, within a year, maybe two, rapidly progress to senior staff data scientist, lead data scientist positions. Only about 5% of all the alumni who have gone on to data science roles and then gone on to something else, only about 5% have stepped into managerial positions. I went in and pulled out anybody that was a product manager because I really just wanted to identify people who were managing teams. So that number is small. There weren't that many product managers either. And that number is small. That number to me is worrying. One of the biggest trends that people keep talking to me about is the lack of data science managers. It's something that we think a lot about at Insight. Come talk to me at office hours if you want to chat about it. Another 17% are all in this sort of miscellaneous bucket. These are people who had new titles. I think some of them in lieu of, and then others in addition to continuing to work as data scientists. So things like consultants, founders, CEOs, advisors to startups or to or in the funding space. Okay, so some of the takeaways that I hope to have imparted to all of you this morning. So finding people in general is pretty easy. You can put up a job posting and watch things pile in on you from Indeed. Finding the right people for your role that you have open now will take some real work. And so don't think that just by hanging out a shingle, you're going to find the best people that you can possibly find. And digging in at the top of your funnel is probably the place that will have not just the highest impact, but will make every future subsequent step that much better for you. The more information that candidates have about the role and the team, the more likely it is that you'll get the best people for the role who actually want it to come and talk to you. So interviews can vary wildly. Do what you like. I'm not here to tell you how to run your interview process, but the process itself shouldn't be opaque. People should understand who they're meeting with, what the sort of expectations are in terms of timeline, how long the process will take. If you need to pause a search for, say you start a search and you're going to do and then all of a sudden you're doing a big reorg. Don't just leave those candidates in limbo waiting for you to get back to them. Tell them, hey, we're we're undergoing some reorganization. We're not sure if the role or when the role might actually fit in the new system, but we're not done here. We'll come back to you. People will respond much better to that than 2 months of radio silence. And yes, you might scare off some people who are like, you seem disorganized if you're having to do this, but that's fine, because if you actually are an organization that has to reorg, you don't want people that are scared by that to be on your team. The career path for data scientists is still really wide open. It's not a path until a bunch of other people have gone down it before, so stay tuned for that. And then finally, I wish you the best of luck. This is a challenging space to be working in. I really enjoy it. It's a tremendous pleasure to get to work with all of these super talented people every day. But it is but it is hard. Thanks all of you for listening. As a reminder, we are still accepting late applications. And then these are some 2 ways to find me in addition to office hours this afternoon.
Any questions?
Hi. So one of the big things that we do that I don't know if is a good idea or not, but in the job description, we try to make it cool. But one of the things that we do is we say, hey, here's like a fun problem, solve it and send it back with the resume type of deal. And we know that it's not too difficult of a problem. And the only concern that I personally have about that is like attrition rate. Because I know that if I'm applying for a job and they're going to make me solve a problem and it's going to take me an hour, I'm probably going to just apply for somewhere else. Unless it's like Google or Facebook or somebody really fancy. So like, do you have any way of quantifying attrition rate? Because maybe I'm the one that's just an asshole, or maybe it's a lot of people and that's why we're severely limiting our applications for good people.
Yeah, so that comes up for us, not so much on our data science application, although we can look at some web metrics and look at like who's actually going to the page and then who actually hits apply and fills it out and some stuff like that. But for our data engineering program, candidates, after they apply, are sent a coding challenge for the engineering program. And we do have some statistics on like how many people actually complete it. So I haven't looked at those numbers. I can't tell you them off the top of my head. But it's a concern that I think you want to weigh against how much do you care about losing people that aren't willing to spend that amount of time or invest that, even if you're not Spotify or Google or whoever. Like if you're still excited to apply and go through that step, I think what you want to be careful about is making sure that bar is not so high that somebody who just already has a job or has is busy, like this idea of like, come work for us for free for a while and then we'll think about it. You want to make sure that you're not just sort of only people who can afford to sink the time in are applying. So keeping that bar relatively easy, an easy enough threshold, but a threshold nonetheless to just sort of weed out the people who are sending their resume literally everywhere they can, I think is probably a good idea. I don't know where the microphone is, but Nick?
I'm wondering if you have any feedback from your candidates on how many of them effectively are doing more data engineering than data science, and because there isn't enough data engineering there, and they're effectively their company's first data engineer all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have numbers on that, except for the number who have actually shifted into a more of an engineering title in their roles, which I do think is an interesting, because those are people who have worked as a data scientist who are officially shifting into a more of an engineering.
LinkedIn split those two professions entirely, like the analysts do data scientists and the machine learning people do data engineering.
Right.
Data engineering.
Yeah, and so that's where it's hard just to go from job titles to like what is someone actually doing in their day-to-day, and that's one of the challenges in general of having a field where there's really only like a half a dozen different things that we call ourselves, and what a data scientist does at a team like the New York Times or a team like BuzzFeed's those could be very different things. They could be very similar things. In one instance, they might end up doing a lot more engineering work, and others they might end up doing a lot more client-facing work. And so those kinds of skills surveys is something that we've thought about doing, but we haven't done quite so much, because this is a thing that comes up a lot when you look at data from LinkedIn of just like what titles do people have. That's sort of the level that I've been able to probe so far, just from looking at our alumni's LinkedIn pages. But then actually digging in more into like, well, what are you actually doing in your day-to-day? What skills are you using every day? And it depends a lot, mostly on the size and scale of the size and stage of the team. But yeah. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you on that.
So I guess my question is, so I find in my experience, data scientists kind of have like three major responsibilities, one being numbers, the second being engineering, and the third being product. And in your example interview process, you kind of hit the numbers and like the analysis and the engineering and the coding, paired coding exercise. But have you seen any examples of good interviews that touch on the product aspect of data science?
So when you say product, do you want to just say a little more about what you mean?
Product as in like being able to translate a user's needs into numbers and identify what is actually the real, kind of like how a UX designer would identify what is the pain that someone's feeling in a user interface, being able to translate what is the pain that someone's feeling and translating it into. I think this is specific to certain types of products where you're selling numbers,
Sure.
as opposed to analyzing your users secretly.
Yeah. So we do this in some of these post-interview surveys that I was referencing earlier. We do ask the fellows, like in these broad categories, what kinds of questions came up in the interview. We're not interested in becoming just like we have no interest in being a resource for what questions did you get, and like so for people to share that information, because we don't think that that's a useful way to run our organization. But what was surprising to us is once we started actually looking at some of these numbers, like a lot of our interview prep material is really focused historically on preparing candidates for some of the stuff that they're weakest in. And so some of that is, for the data scientists, it's things like sort of like classic textbook, like CS, some fundamentals of CS, or stats like probability distributions and things like that. And so we're really heavy on like, just make sure that you have those basics so that you don't get caught off guard. And something that came up in these surveys quite a bit was just the number of open-ended questions that teams are asking candidates. And so the number of interviews where you're actually maybe you are at a whiteboard, maybe not, but not because you're writing pseudocode or actual code, but actually because you're mapping out like how you might think about if you have these users and then they have these concerns and you're thinking about opening a new store or a new location, or those kinds of questions where you're actually really dissecting a problem in conversation with someone. Those are very, very common. I think one thing that's interesting about those things is I don't know that it's just really about product necessarily. I think it can be about a lot of areas. In our interview process, when we talk to candidates, and I'm happy to share this with you, we look for 4 categories, and they're very similar to what you were talking about. So we're looking for hands-on experience with real data. So we're suspicious when we see only simulation work. We want to see some exposure to real data to have some sense of like what you should and shouldn't trust. Experience with statistics, experience in coding, and then communication skills. And for us, communication skills is not just eloquence or how articulate someone can be in explaining their research or talking about complicated topics, but what's the sort of back and forth of their communication? Do they actually listen to the questions I'm asking? Do they seem really annoyed when I interrupt them to clarify a point? Or are they actually like excited to clarify the point? And not in like a fake way, but are they actually interested in having a real communication with me, or are they just there to lay information out to me and communicate at me as opposed to with me? That's something that we've been modifying our own interview process increasingly to try to capture that signal a little bit more. It's kind of a long answer, sorry. There's one more at the back. And I'm sorry, it's quite bright over here, so I can't see if there's hands coming up.
Thanks. So how do you balance, when you're trying to look at your pool of data scientists when you first put out an interview or a job description, how do you balance the ease of your alumni network with like a diverse pool of candidates? Because it's very easy for me to go find another physicist, like me, or someone who looks like me from my own alumni network. or a professional background.
So you mean how do we like make sure we're connecting to groups of like departments that we don't have alumni from, for example?
Yeah, I mean, not so much you guys, but like as a hiring manager and you're looking for candidates, you know, like obviously I will go and like look at my professional network and my alumni network, but those people look very much like me, right?
Yeah.
So, but in the interest of like diversity and, you know, any types of diversity you want to talk about, like you're not going to have that diverse pool if you're looking at people like yourself.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like how much you actually care about or value that that diversity, or like what you're going to be gaining from having those candidates in your pipeline or ultimately joining your team. We care about it a lot, and so we put a lot of work into it. We're sort of like constantly thinking and working on the way that we're conducting the outreach that we do, improvements that we can make, ways to widen that funnel, ways to partner with other organizations, and just trying to like do all of the things that we like I said before, like doing the things that aren't scalable necessarily, that we can just try as many of them that we suspect might work, and then when we hit on something really good, try to recreate that across other fields or other areas. So we put a lot of value on it. So we're heavily invested in that. For other organizations and other teams, I think it depends. You know, like hiring is one of the many things that people have to worry about. I think it's the most important one, but that's me. And so you know, it should be, I think, a lot of time and energy. But you're right that it comes at the cost, because it does take time, and a lot of times, you know, you go and talk to people and, you know, they might not be interested. That's okay, you know.